Hi. Hello, my name is Eliades. Today we're at St. George in Clifton, and we're going to be doing an oral history interview about your Greek American experience and your family's experience living here in America. So, you can introduce yourself.
My name is Maria Eliades. I am 32 years old. I grew up in Wayne, New Jersey. I was born in New York. I grew up coming to St. George in Clifton, so it's actually really nice to be here and to do this interview. My father was born in Istanbul, Turkey. Half of my family is part of the Greek minority from Asia Minor. The other half of my family is from Kozani, Greece. And my mom, whose parents were born in Kozani, was born in New York.
Okay. So, how about we first talk about your family and how you got to be here in New York? They started off living first.
Yeah, so I guess we'll start with my maternal grandparents because they came over to the States first.
Okay.
My grandfather Zesis came over in the early 20th century. They first actually started out in New Hampshire because they were weavers by trade.
Okay.
And he moved around quite a lot, and eventually he ended up in New York. My grandmother was a war bride. She came over to the States after World War II, a seamstress by trade. The families knew each other, and basically threw a letter and a picture of my grandfather, said, "He's waiting for you in America. Will you marry him?" My grandmother looked around at Greece after World War II, which was in the Civil War, and said, yes. So just came to New York, not knowing him, not knowing anyone, just this trust, I guess, of this will be better. I mean, this is as far as I know, right? This is the family mythology.
Right.
And then my father's family came over in 1959. It was him, his twin brother, and his parents. There was my great uncle who was already here in Astoria. And so that's where they ended up settling. My great uncle helped sponsor my grandfather, and that helped bring the family over. And that's where my parents met in Astoria.
Okay. So your mother lived in Astoria most of her life,
Yeah.
correct? And your father did as well.
My father lived in Astoria from the age of 13.
Okay. So do you know how their life was like in Astoria, being in that like Greek bubble almost? Kind of.
I mean, as far as I know, with like how they grew up, I mean, they went to St. Demetrius Church. My father belonged to the Boy Scout troop there, which I think helped a lot with integrating. It was the troop was from the church, so it was all these other Greek Americans or first generation born Greeks. And he doesn't describe too much more about his childhood other than that when coming to the States. That and having say like a year of ESL classes,
Yeah.
and then just being thrown into things. And my mom was really involved with the community. She was part of the choir. She was part of what's the organization that's not Daughters of Penelope, but one further down, Maids of Athena.
Yeah.
So she was a member of that growing up. And she spoke Greek in the household. She's bilingual. It wasn't her father so much as it was her father's family who would insist on speaking Greek and nothing else in the house itself. So that was a great part of her growing up and her identity and everything. And she had mostly Greek friends. She just doesn't really talk to the people who weren't Greek at this point. They just, I don't know, didn't stick together. I'm not quite sure why. Yeah, no, I mean, that experience, it sounds like in some ways Astoria was a bit of a Greek village.
Right.
I mean, sure, you associated with other people, but it seems like from the way that my parents describe it that they mostly associated with Greek people. And even in my first few years of childhood, I thought that people only spoke Greek in Astoria.
Yeah.
And it was actually my first language. My parents spoke Greek to me when I was born. They did not speak English to me really consistently until I went to kindergarten.
That's really interesting. So do you think, I mean, from what you're saying, obviously Greek culture and the heritage had a huge influence on your childhood. Do you think it had an influence going on further now that you're a lot older and have like your own career path going ahead?
Definitely because of the sense of identity. I mean, it's kind of crazy to believe that about 100 years ago or less that Greeks weren't considered to be white.
Mhm.
But even now, in the way that I grew up and knowing that like our holidays are different from all of the Catholic and Protestant holidays, and that's the general rhythm that the United States goes along of that being the assumed preset.
Mhm.
I've never felt white in the sense that that's what I feel is white, of being like
Right.
Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, possibly Catholic even. And it's always felt different of knowing, I grew up knowing that there was someplace else other than this country, that my family came from someplace else,
Mhm.
especially since my father was born in Turkey.
Mhm.
That left a very large mark. And in the work that I've chosen to do, it's inevitably shaped my life path. I mean, I went to Turkey and I lived there from the time that I was 24, almost pretty solidly until I was almost 31.
Mhm. Wow.
I ended up doing research on the Greek city in the 1950s because it was something I was very curious about. It's something that's really interested me, of knowing what was there, knowing that the version of Greek identity that I've been taught here, which is mainly focused on mainland Greece, is not the whole story, and it's not my whole story. I think probably subconsciously it was feeling kind of left out. That
Right.
sense of knowing, like, but my father talked to me about Istanbul all the time.
Mhm.
His childhood there, I don't know, not the food they would eat so much, but all these different things, and that left a huge mark. Um, and so I wanted to discover it for myself. So it's, in a way, my Greek identity is entirely shaped my life path. I went on, when I was in between the years that I was in Turkey, I went to England, to Oxford for my master's degree, and I studied modern Greek.
Wow. That's incredible. That's incredible. I couldn't even speak words. I'd really like if you talk about not so much your research, but just living in Istanbul, doing your research, particularly, and trying to identify your research on, the Greek cities. I think was there a challenge trying to find that information, considering there's so much going on between Greece and Istanbul and Turkey.
I mean, the biggest challenge was really the Greek community there. They are not very trusting. I don't blame them.
Hmm.
Uh, I'm sort of an insider outsider in that, I have roots there, but I was not born there. The Greek minority at this point, the majority of them speak better Turkish than they do Greek, especially people my age and younger. Or even, I made a trip the other month to go back there, the first time since I've left a year and a half ago.
Hmm.
And at one of the churches, I was looking for these records. There was a guy there who was Greek, Rum, as they say in
Hmm.
Turkish, so Romios, and he really didn't speak Greek. So we conversed in Turkish. We got it
Wow.
all done in Turkish,
Yeah.
which is sort of, and he was older, so
Hmm.
that surprised me. I usually don't find that to be true. So that was a great challenge of getting people to open up to me and trust me. If my Greek had been completely fluent, like a native speaker, it might have been easier. I think that was a barrier because as much as I can try it, I'd have to live in Greece, honestly,
Right.
to bring it up to that type of fluency. And I can read quite a lot. My writing's not so great. I can speak pretty decently, but
Hmm.
I'm not a native speaker.
Right.
Um, that was a challenge. As far as getting other information, well, I mean, I learned Turkish. Part of it was because I wanted to know what was going on around me. Another reason was I really wanted to be a part of things and really see things for how they were and what was going on. And I also really wanted to do research in Turkish too. I wanted to see the other side of things. And having that language, in addition to Greek, really opened up a lot for me. Uh, the big challenge that anyone faces, I think, doing research on minorities in Turkey is the communities themselves and the lack of trust, and then sometimes a lack of research.
Hmm.
There is research that's been done about earlier periods, like late Ottoman period of minorities. There's not as much research that has been done on the 1950s, on the 40s. It's piecemeal. You have to patch it together. Fortunately, I arrived at a time in which there was growing interest and openness in all of it. In 2010, Istanbul was the European capital of culture. So suddenly there was this interest in this narrative about multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism. Some of it was very made up, I think, frankly, because it's like, well, you had
Yeah, it was there.
multiculturalism, and you got rid of it
Right.
under the Project of the Republic. It's, a flaw in nationalism could take a very impersonal stance of saying, like, well, this is what happens. Greece really isn't much better
Mm-hmm.
as far as its multiculturalism goes, and its racism and all sorts of things. So some of it is just an endemic issue. But I can take it personally too, say, well, my family was here and got pushed out due to politics, due to all of these bigger things. Yeah, I think those are really the biggest issues. So I think there is the possibility for more research to be done
Mm-hmm.
on the Greeks there and to see things. And I've been in the process of writing a novel about the 1950s, about present. And I've built up, in a way, I guess, this map in my head
Mm-hmm.
of all these different places that used to exist, whether they were Greek, whether they were just whatever shops happened at the time, whatever way of life that existed. Um, but it's hard. It's like you feel
Yeah.
like you're holding this imaginary space that probably mostly once existed all in your head, and there are very few people who understand what that was, and very few people who also understand that project too,
Right.
of putting that together, of wanting to put that together, and also of being open to Turkey as it is today, and Istanbul as it is today.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you talked about your father and how he had like an influence on your life, and especially because he was from Istanbul. Can you talk about that a little bit and how it kind of shaped your experience, especially when people talk about Greek school and you're there learning about, the heritage, and not a lot is mentioned about Istanbul or as much.
I mean, I think it fed like a lot of curiosity. So when I was in undergrad, I was a classics minor. I focused on ancient Greece, and it was sort of part of this, I guess, education project for myself of like, let me learn what actually happened and
Mm-hmm.
really learn about it. And along the way, I started reading about Byzantine history too. So John Julius Norwich's 3-volume Byzantium extravaganza was some of my bedside reading material. I don't know how much I actually remember of all of it, but I think it was that greater sense of there's something more here, and there's more to Greek identity than there is about the mainland or the islands. I mean, I think a lot of it's also influenced by the people in the broader community, which I'm not really sure who was here at the time when I was in St. George,
Mm-hmm.
from, let's say, like the late 80s through the early 2000s.
Maybe like Fuka. I'm not really sure who was
Yeah.
here.
No, but I mean also
Oh,
as
just
far as the
generally.
parishioners go and their
Yeah,
heritage, I get the sense that a lot of them were from the islands. That's a
probably.
very distinct version of Greek culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so my father's end of things, I think, just influenced me to look further
Mm-hmm.
and to be interested and curious. And I think in growing up really caused me not to identify with a lot of the community too. And we didn't go to Greece growing up. That's the other thing. My classmates in Greek school did.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a major thing. They went every summer. I didn't go for the first time until I was 15.
Major difference.
Major difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that influenced the way that you saw Greece, or was it kind of that still like ambiguous, like where do I fit in, kind of? Not where do I fit in, but like where do I connect with the people that are going to Greece consistently? I don't know if that makes sense.
I don't. Well, I mean, I'll answer and you tell me if this is what
Okay.
you're looking for. I don't.
It's like read my mind.
Yeah, I don't think it really changed how I saw them
Okay.
because I still couldn't relate to them.
Right.
But it was. I remember the first time I went to Greece, and it was actually with Ionian Village, and then my mom met up with me, and we toured around Greece for a week, and I met my relatives for the first time.
Okay.
So it was a really meaningful trip. But I remember we were taking the bus down to the Peloponnese where the camp is, and from Eleftheros Venizelos Airport, the old one, and I saw a billboard in Greek, and it might have been for like a stick of gum or for cigarettes, I forget what it was, but it was just this one moment of like, oh my god, it's real.
Yeah.
It's like, it's a real language. It's not this thing that's been made up to torture me twice a week. In Greek school, it's a real living language that people use, like contemporary people use.
Right.
And so it was the start of being able to see the country as something fantastic, and also being able to see it as something that's not just related to the church,
Right.
because in the United States, the diaspora is the identity, the community is all through the church. This has been the way of keeping everyone together. Fortunately or unfortunately, that means that if you are not entirely religious, or if you don't relate to the version of it, or whatever it is, you might not find your place in there as well.
Right.
You know, as invested as I was in the church at the time that I was growing up, seeing it on its own is something that provides multifacets of being alive and expressing oneself and the beauty of the language
Mm-hmm.
was something that made a huge impression on that trip. And so I came back, and maybe I did have a greater sense of my identity because I got to go there. And this expanded in the years to come when I went over with my whole family, when I went over actually for a month-long study abroad trip with my university,
Mm-hmm.
and also in that trip with my family, we went to Turkey for the first time. And
That's
so all of that like really shaped my relationship to the heritage, and something, it transformed it. It didn't feel stuck.
right.
It made me more curious.
Mm-hmm. I think that was where I was going.
Okay.
Okay. So that was kind of like leading into my next question. So, obviously, Greek Orthodox is like a major influence in Greek people's lives for the most part, not always. But how do you think it affected your own life, being part of the church, having that heritage, and then having to, I guess, like come together under the Greek Orthodox Church at the end of the day?
I mean, I think it really affected and still even affects my sense of the year. So like my sort of internal calendar is like, okay, when is Easter this year? When is, well, Christmas is solid and stable, but like those are kind of the two poles still of my year, even though I don't identify as being religious at this point. I consider myself to be spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of what I learned here influenced my viewpoints in life and a lot of philosophies that I have.
Mm-hmm.
That's, yeah, definitely not something I can separate from myself. Um, yeah, I don't know. It leads me to feeling slightly different again from everyone else. And then I suppose it's just strange when you don't identify more broadly with the community.
Right.
You feel like you're part of this is a shared experience, and yet you don't feel like you're completely part of
Right.
it. So it's difficult.
Do you mean as part of this community specifically, or like communities in like the American community? I just want to clarify.
Greek American or American?
Like Greek American, do you mean, or like I guess American generally?
Greek American.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So, I had a question in mind. I forgot what I was going to ask. What was I going to say? Oh, that's what I was to ask. Okay. So obviously you've had this different experience growing up as a Greek American and having different cultures and heritages as your other American and probably of other heritages as well. How do you think that how do you find that difference um, to play in your life? Like, how does that affect your life, or does it at all?
You, well, I mean, what sense are you thinking?
In the sense of like Italians have different heritages and we have different customs. We Italians have different customs and Greek Americans also have different customs. Do you think that difference has affected the way that you see an Italian American or a German American or etc.?
I don't think, I mean, any differences I'd see from anyone who's Italian or German, whatever background they have, doesn't come from being Greek American.
Okay.
Most of the time. I think it mostly comes from just being American and having like, okay, these are the people I bumped into. This is what I know about it. This is what exists in popular culture. I mean, it more depends honestly on how long the family has been here. So I see people who have come over more recently, I feel like I identify with them more.
Mm-hmm.
Those especially actually with Middle Eastern backgrounds. sometimes it's most of the time it's a lot stronger of like, oh boy, like I don't pity you for some of this, like this is rougher than my parents.
Right.
But I find I identify a lot with that, especially in pop culture. It makes me really happy to see things with Indian American families. Like there was a film on Netflix somewhat recently about this Indian American actor whose parents have been wanting him to get married for years. He'd had this basically like white non-Indian girlfriend, and he broke up with her, and then he agreed, okay, like I'll do this like matchmaking circuit. And while we don't have that at this point, there was just something about the emphasis on family
Right.
that they have that I really stuck into a lot, and also just the insistence, even in my own family, of like they wouldn't say like you have to marry a Greek guy, but it was kind of there in the background. I mean, my grandmother, my mom's mom, would say to me sometimes like one day, you know, you'll meet a nice Greek boy and you'll make house for him, and I'm just like, oh, God, yeah, okay, yeah, sure. But I think that that emphasis on family is one of the things that really sets apart, I guess, how I see everyone else, and also like guest culture too, where I don't see that in other like immigrant groups that have come here, well, further back. I mean, those that have come here more recently, or say those from the Middle East, or those from places closer to Greece, still have a lot of that, and I identify with that quite a lot. And so more recently, especially since living in Turkey for so long, which has a very similar culture to Greece, and that part of things has actually become more important to me. So I think I might be infecting your study a little bit by being slightly different in the fact that I went over there and lived there because if I hadn't, maybe I wouldn't identify with these things nearly as much.
Right.
But those are two things that really stand out. And so at this point, I do feel closer to people who have that as part of their background and things that they also value.
Right. So do you find that the lifestyles here in America are different than you've been able to live for quite a long time in Turkey, and been able to visit in Greece? So do you find that the lifestyles have been different in each of the places, especially like the cultures are going to be different as well?
Yeah, I mean, the difference between Greece and Turkey, like Greece and Turkey, honestly, do not have huge differences. The biggest difference is religion, and that affects everything. But other than that, it's really terribly similar. Familial relationships, the guest culture, the warmth, the ability to spend forever over a cup of tea or coffee, the emphasis on food and people,
Right.
and all of these things, the way that they work. I mean, I haven't worked in Greece, so I don't know, but I just kind of assume from what I hear about other things. In Turkey, it's very much a case of things will be done really slowly, and then all of a sudden you have a deadline, so you're up until I don't know what hour getting everything done,
Right.
which still drives me crazy.
Mm-hmm.
I found ways of basically mitigating that when I was working in Turkey, so I didn't have to deal with that. So there's that sense of things that's really different, and there's such warmth and invitingness there. It's the things that I've experienced there and in Greece that people are just so willing to meet strangers and to open up to them, to spend time with them. And I find in North America and also in England that we're not like that. It feels very cold after being there for so long.
Right.
There's more, especially I think in the Northeast, it's a lot of people are running all over the place. They feel like they don't have time for themselves, let alone anyone else, and they're less likely to invest time on someone versus over there, it's everything.
Right.
It's like, what else are you going to do with yourself? You're going to invest in these people.
Right.
Could be another good friend, you know. Strangers are just friends you haven't met yet.
Right. That's really interesting. Okay, so I only have a few more questions left. So what do you find as one of the biggest challenges that Greece is facing today?
The economy.
Okay.
Still, I mean, and the bureaucracy that's involved with the economy. I mean, with all these austerity measures, which were proven to be not something that would actually save the country, there weren't any reforms done to how long it takes to form up a business, the paperwork involved, anything like that. It's like the Germans couldn't have placed that on there, being like, hey, we do it this way. Maybe you should cut through all this instead. I mean, I'm sure there are people who benefit from the process of the paperwork on the governmental end. I don't know for a fact, but I'm sure there are. Um, yeah, I mean, because there are so many smart Greeks that I've met all over the place, and it's upsetting to see them continuously having to go abroad. I have cousins who are abroad because they can't find work in Greece and they have advanced degrees. One's an economist, and he did his PhD here in the States. Now he's in Ireland. Now he's going to come back to the U.S. His brother is in Amsterdam.
A lot of travel.
Yeah, it's a lot of travel. I know other people I met when I was at Oxford who are staying in the UK and are not necessarily happy with it. Other Greeks that have ended up in Turkey, some have gone back to Greece, some have stayed, some love it in Turkey, some it's sort of like, well, this is the way forward. And it's a feeling of new exile, and it's really a shame for the whole country.
Right.
You know, there is a brain drain going on, and I wish there was a way for it to be reversed. I think they do too. Politics do present a challenge for Greece too, but I don't know. It seems with every election that the same politicians are in place no matter what their parties are, so there's something within the DNA of the system perhaps that creates it.
Right. Okay. And then the last two questions are kind of just still about the present situation. So, what's your stance on the current situation between Turkey and Greece, in Cyprus specifically?
I don't know what the solution is. I wish I did. I kind of think like it's an impossible thing to solve. Honestly, I don't know what the Greek Cypriots want. I know the Turkish Cypriots aren't exactly fond of Turkey being there. In Turkey, they call Cyprus the little homeland, which actually the Turkish Cypriots don't like very much. I've been to Cyprus. I've been to both sides. I know the Greek Cypriots would not like that I just said that, but yes, fine. There's the cowboy state in the north, but it's still a state. I mean, frankly, the EU should never have let in the Republic on its own without solving the whole island issue of reunifying it. I mean, ideally, shouldn't an island like that be together? I mean, there are a lot of challenges in governing it, but that was a mistake, a mess. On the Turkish side of things, there are a lot of Turks from Turkey that were moved in there who have no relation to it. There are a lot of Africans who are there who are lured with the promise of free tuition at these Turkish universities in the north that have ended up working in hotels.
Yeah.
So it's economically a mess. In the Republic, from what I've seen, things are very stifled. There doesn't seem to be much innovation. There's this intransigence. They don't want to work with anyone. They see themselves as better than Greece. I don't know what Greece's stance is these days on Cyprus. I wish there was any solution. The discovery of oil has not made things easier. It will continue to complicate things. So I honestly don't know what's going to happen. And I really hope that the Greeks in Turkey will not be scapegoated once again, as they have been throughout the 20th century for Cyprus, because that is part of the reason why, well, I exist, because in 1955, the pogrom that happened in Istanbul was because of Cyprus. They associated both the Greeks in Cyprus are called Rum, as are the Greeks of Turkey, because the whole name came from the fact that the Byzantines did not call themselves Byzantines, they called themselves Romans.
Yeah.
So there's this equal association, there was this scapegoating. There was 55, there was 64 where there were deportations from Turkey of those who were Greek citizens and those that were deemed to be terrorists. And then there were 74 as well. So these things gradually emptied out the community.
Right.
They have been directly tied. There's not there aren't too many Greeks left in Turkey at this point. Maybe about 2,000 in total.
Oh,
I would love for Cyprus to be solved. I don't have any great faith that it will be.
yeah, definitely. I just don't know either. Yeah. So I don't know if you have anything else to share. Those were the end of my questions,
Okay.
but I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Is there anything else that like I touched on that you want to hear more about?
I think I pretty much asked you as you were going along, but if you have anything else that I didn't touch on that you'd like to share, feel free. Otherwise,
Okay. I guess like the one last thing is like just my sense of Greek heritage at this point is maybe a bit loose. It's more of the sense of like how Kavaki talked about it, of being what it means to be Greek is actually more of what the definition was during Alexander's empire. If you value the language and value the culture and you try to speak the language, then that is who you are. And so I feel even though that my version of being Greek from my father's side, which is not really talked about or acknowledged in Greek America, is not part of the identity because it is part of that broader thing. It's like, this is what I grew up with. I'm Greek American. This is who I am.
mm-hmm. Well, awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
That was awesome.
Yeah, awesome. I'm glad that I hope I gave you valuable things.
Absolutely.